Welcome everyone to this talk. I'm going to talk about two topics that I think a lot of people think that they are not unitable, which is open source and business. Because open source is like everything's free and business is like everything should earn us money. But it's an important thing because, okay, so how many of you here are developers? Most of you, okay. How many of you commercially build stuff that you get money for, but you build it on top of open source? Almost the same amount of hands. So that, yeah, okay. So how many of you actually contribute something back to open source? That's quite a lot of hands, but it's less than the ones that we had before. So, okay, this is a good talk for especially the people that didn't raise their hand last time. Let's introduce myself a bit. This is a very old picture at one of the best conferences in the world, PHP Northwest. It doesn't exist anymore, sorry. My name is Stefan Koopmanschap. I run a company called Ingewikkeld here in the Netherlands. And ingewikkeld is the Dutch word for complex, which is how I like my projects. It's not just me. We're with a couple of people, including my partner Mike and my wife. With the three of us own the business, and we try to run it as best as we can. And before I started Ingewikkeld, I worked for a lot of different other companies that basically everywhere they used open source, but not everywhere they actually contributed back to the open source projects that they were using. I started doing PHP. This is might also be interesting for context. I started doing PHP somewhere at the end of '97, beginning of '98. How many people here have used PHP 3? That's actually quite a lot. We're old people here. Especially me, thank you very much. Okay, anyway, so Ingewikkeld, PHP, and I started doing PHP 97, 98, and quickly after that I started also doing something with open source. Not just PHP, which by itself is open source, but I also started using this software called PHPBB. Back in the days of version 1 point something. And I liked it a lot, and at some point I realized if I have a question, then I can post on their forums, and I get an answer from someone that has more experience than me with using PHPBB. And not long after that, I started, instead of just asking questions, I started also answering questions. And that was my first contribution to the open source community. It wasn't code, but it was at least a way for me to give back to the community that gave me free software to use. Now, a lot of you will probably have seen the picture in the next slide. A lot of modern infrastructure, tech infrastructure, is built on top of open source. And that's all fine and dandy until you realize that there is this one project maintained by a single person that's the building block of everything on top of that. So what happens if that one person that is maintaining that project is no longer able to maintain that project? What happens? I mean, there's so many things that can happen, right? I mean, they can just lose interest. They don't care anymore. But they can also change jobs and not have time anymore to maintain it. Or maybe they run into a burnout because they've been trying to maintain a job and work on that open source project at the same time. Or worse, what if they die? How many people of you have heard of the bus factor? A lot of people. The bus factor is basically what happens to a project or a company when a single person gets hit by a bus. Then you have a problem. If that one person is the key person for your project, for your company, that is a problem. So what happens to your project? Now, a personal note. Earlier this year, this is me and Bob den Otter. Earlier this year, Bob den Otter died. Now, Bob den Otter was very important in a lot of places. amongst which the Dutch weblog community, in the time when blogging just started in the Netherlands, he built a tool called Pivot. which was a blogging tool, and later he built PivotX as well. That was also a blogging tool. And then he built Bolt CMS, and Bolt CMS is built on top of Symfony. It's a CMS which, to me, felt like this is great because it's so easy, it's very flexible. But he was basically the only one really contributing to that project. So in January 18 of this year, I got a direct message on Mastodon from a mutual friend saying, Bob passed away. And I didn't know how to deal with that on a personal level because he was a friend, but also on the development level because he was running a business, he was running open source projects. So this talk is dedicated now to Bob. And let's make sure that we can have open source projects that can survive someone not being there anymore. So what happens to a project when someone loses interest or when they cannot maintain the project anymore? First of all, the project will start running behind because it gets outdated, the dependencies move on, but the project doesn't, and at some point you cannot maybe install it anymore, or you have to make your own hacks to get it to work, or to get it up to date, because if they use old, outdated dependencies and that has a security issue, then you have a problem as well if you run that software. You get less updates or no updates anymore of the project, and at some point there might be a security problem in that project itself as well. And in the very worst case, the whole project is abandoned, which might not be a big problem for one of the 5,000 libraries that are there that can add 2 numbers, because you can easily switch to another one. But it's a bit harder if you've built your whole business on top of one of these projects. What if one of the projects that you use on a daily basis for all the stuff that you earn your money with, from one day to the next, it's not there anymore, or at least it's not updated anymore? Then you have a big problem. You cannot just replace that. So, back to this picture. What if that project gets abandoned? And you have that huge application built on top of this, or maybe built on top of that up there. What happens? That's a problem. And this is why companies that use open source should find a way to contribute back to the projects that they use. They should start supporting the community that they depend on, the software that they depend on. It's not just about being a good open source citizen. It's about business continuity. It's about not having to invest millions and millions to rebuild your whole application on top of something else that might at some point not exist anymore. And this is definitely not advertisement to then build everything yourself, because really don't do that. So I'll go into some more reasons, because there are more reasons to support open source. I'll go into some more reasons later, but let's first tell you some stories. An important reason why I'm speaking on this specific subject is because in one way or another, I've done a lot with open source by myself and also out of my company Ingewikkeld. And, you know, that's why I think more companies should do that. And if I look at, for instance, since a couple of years now, we have, in the PHP world, we have the PHP Foundation. The PHP Foundation actually funds developers that work on the language. How many people of you are supporting the PHP Foundation? Okay, no shame on those that don't raise their hands. How many of your employers support the PHP Foundation? It's about the same people. Not sure even? Okay, that's interesting. This is the thing. If I go to the PHP Foundation page and I look at the people that donate to the foundation, there is surprisingly little companies. And most of the companies that are there are relatively small companies, like Ingewikkeld, that keep donating to keep PHP existing. Not the big multi-billion-dollar companies that earn a lot of money by using PHP. Not sure what's happening here. So that got me thinking I need to convince people that we should support open source more. Not just PHP, because there's a lot of projects out there that really need our support. So, my first story, I worked for a company and they made a real effort to support open source. They gave their employees time to work on open source. They had some open source packages themselves, aimed mostly, of course, at their own use cases, at their own business, but that's okay. They still open sourced it, they maintained it, and other people could use it. So that was actually pretty cool. And it was very nice to work there. But at some point, let's just say that company, they had relatively low rates that they charged their clients, which is cool for their clients, and which is also cool for their salespeople because they were able to sell a lot of projects. But then the economy went down, and it was harder to sell stuff. It was harder to get in projects. It was harder to still basically run their business in the way that they did. They were not building up a lot of reserves in the good times. So when the bad times came, they had to stop their open source project, which was really, or their contributions, which was really sad. And then when the economy went up again, they didn't restart it. And that was bad for the morale of the developers, because they were like, we want to do our open source contributions again. So while they were trying to make an effort, they hadn't adapted their business to that. So what's the story that we can learn from this is that your rates should be high enough to support the contributions that you make to open source. And you should not feel guilty to your customers that you overcharge them, because you don't. Your customers benefit from what you do to those open source projects that you then use for them. So it is in their interest that people start contributing and that you are contributing to that project. So this is a good lesson to learn, is that if you do something, if you want to contribute something to open source, make sure that your rates reflect the fact that you spent some of your time, that is time that costs money, you reflect your rates to cover that. Make sure that you do that. Now the next case was, let's say it was a mistake for me as well. I was working at a company, and they were not doing any open source contributions yet. They were very much consuming open source, but they were not really giving anything back until I joined their company. And the reason why they hired me was because they wanted to do more with contributions to open source. I was the person that was supposed to start that in that business. So after talking to a couple of people, including one of the owners and the project manager, I came up with, well, you know, probably the 20% rule, basically, where you can spend 20% of your work time on open source projects. This is something that Google did for a long time, and a lot of other companies do that. So I proposed, let's do that. Let's take the Friday, and on Friday, we make contributions to the open source projects that we use. So the owner was okay with that. The project manager was like, yeah, okay, but we have to make some changes to how we run our projects, of course, because our planning will be different if we don't work on projects for 5 days, but for 4 days. But I'm okay with that. We can do that. So we did that. We started implementing that, and that was fine. It actually worked well. We did some cool contributions to the projects that we were using at that time. We even organized some events. And then the problem arose that one of the owners was okay with it, and he was the person doing the finances and stuff like that. He was okay with it. And we had adjusted the rates to reflect this, to be able to do this. But there was another owner, and he was responsible for sales. And he was very much the type of person that would say, well, open source is there, so we're going to use it and we're going to earn a lot of money on it, but we don't want to give anything back because it's still there, right? So we don't have to do anything. And so he was not really okay with us implementing this new 20% rule. And since he was doing sales, he just kept on selling projects and promising to reach certain deadlines and not taking the 20% into account. And that's when we run into problems. Because now he's coming to us saying, well, but I promised that this project would be done for that specific date, and we're already nearing that date, and you're not even halfway. And we were like, yeah, but, well, we said we needed this much time, and you sold it for this much time. That's not our problem, is it? But of course, he is the owner. So yeah, that's a bit of an issue. So what I learned from this one was that I made a mistake in that I didn't get all of the management on board. I got the people that I thought were important for this on board. The project manager was okay, the finance guy was okay, but not everyone was okay, and I didn't get everyone on board. And that was a problem because now, yeah, we couldn't do everything that we needed to do. So, here's another lesson: get everyone on board. And it isn't easy to get started with open source in a company, especially if you're not used to it. The fact that instead of 5 days a week, you only have 4 days a week is a pretty big change. And telling your customers that all of a sudden they need to pay 20% more is also a challenge. Of course, there are ways to handle that, like your existing clients won't pay more, but any new client you get in will pay more. That will allow you to basically fund your own open source contributions. But there are a couple of things that we should look at. As I mentioned, get the full support, especially of the management. If you don't have the whole management on board, you're gonna run into trouble at some point. So that's very important. Adjust your rates so they can cover the cost of that extra time that you're now spending not working for money. That is also very important. And I cannot tell you what your rates should be, because that really depends on the situation. It's like the famous developer saying, it depends. And your rates may be higher than mine or lower than mine, I don't care, as long as your rates will be able to cover the time that you spent on open source. That's the most important, because that ensures the continuity of your business. If your company is just starting, or if you are just starting as a freelancer and you also want to do this, that is the best moment to start thinking about this, right at the start. Because if you're used to it from the start, it's a lot easier to keep doing that. When we started Ingewikkeld, the first thing I did was say, okay, I will only be billable for 32 hours a week. And the Friday is for, well, my administrative stuff, and because that also needs to be done, but then also for open source contributions in one way or another. By doing that directly from the start, everyone, including my customers, are used to the rates that they pay, the way that I work, the fact that I'm not available on Friday, unless there's like a big downtime or something, then I will help. But yeah, just so if you start doing this immediately, that's the easiest way of doing it. So, how did we start with Ingewikkeld? Well, at first it was just me as a freelancer, basically, and I just did the 32 hours billable, and then everything else I could spend on other stuff. But at some point, I was crazy enough to actually hire some people, but I did the same thing. When I hired them as well, they were only billable for 32 hours every week, and any extra hours that they had could be spent on open source or internal projects or things like that. So Monday to Thursday, it was projects, it was customer work, and then on Friday, we could do the stuff that we liked. Now, there is a lot of ways that you can support open source. It doesn't always have to be just code. For instance, we organized an event called WeCamp. Woohoo, okay, I heard that. Which was, we get a bunch of developers on an island. Oh, you even have the dopper here, nice. We get a bunch of developers on an island in tents, out of their comfort zone, and just let them work together on something that they think of themselves. That will improve their knowledge, their experience, that will take them out of their comfort zone, that will actually help the community as a whole. That's definitely one of the ways that you can do that. We did ingewikkeld sessions. We have some developers working for us that work on PHP Documenter, so we allow them during work time to work on new developments for PHP Documenter. We organized WeCamp, as I mentioned, and we organized, when COVID hit, we couldn't do WeCamp anymore, so we were one of the many people that thought, oh, we're going to do an online event. But it was fun. It was a lot of fun. And the great thing is, aside from it being useful for people, we just had fun. And that's also important. So, as I said, there are a lot of ways of contributing to open source. It's not just about code. And I asked a couple of our people, what did they do for open source in a certain period? And so a lot of people said, or gave me input, things like writing rector rules to migrate from mockery to prophecy for their tests, because they were doing a project where this was a thing. So let's just open source a rector rule, and so that can be automated. Bug reports to the Psalm project, add PHP 8 support for some of the PHP Documenter components. Some people did bug reports for Symfony. A bug report is also a contribution, right? You don't even have to give them the fix. Just reporting the bug is already a contribution. Some people contributed to a PSR, and another interesting one is just help people that use open source projects, either on Twitter or on Reddit or Stack Overflow or any of those platforms. IRC, if you still use that, or Slack or whatever. There's a lot of places where you can just answer the questions of other users, like how I started back in the days of PHPBB, just by answering questions. Because if you do it as a regular user, then the maintainers of the project can focus on other stuff. So it's really helpful to even just answer questions. So that's some of the things that we did. Now I think that it's important, if you want to start with contributing to open source, to start small. You don't immediately have to open source your own framework, or your own CMS, or something like that. You can start with a bug report, or add a unit test to a project, or maybe even fix a typo in the documentation. I mean, there's people that have made their whole career based on fixing typos in the documentation of Symfony. It's, you know, stuff like that is also a contribution. It also helps. One of the things that I did after PHPBB was translate Zen framework documentation from English to Dutch. It doesn't feel like a big contribution, but to people that are not very good at native English, it's a great way to get into using a project. So that's a great way to contribute. If that's your thing, that's your thing. And of course, doing a whole translation for a big project is a big thing already. So find something small first, and then move on to maybe something bigger. I mentioned already, answering questions anywhere. These days, there are so many platforms where you can ask questions and answer questions. Just find one. Start small, and you can always grow bigger after that. Now, one question that I've had a lot over the years is, but how do I pick which project I want to contribute to? Because a lot of people think, well, if I make a contribution to open source, I should do the contribution to the Linux kernel. or to one of the major PHP frameworks. And of course, you can do that. That's fine. But I pick something that you are familiar with. That's the first thing, because you should be familiar with a project before you can contribute something. Or you should be willing to dive into it, but it's easier when you already know the project. And you should pick something where you think that your contribution will actually help. And the best way to figure that out is to, for instance, just contact the maintainer and ask them, hey, if I would now start contributing to your project, what would be the best way to contribute to your project? It's not that hard. It's just asking a question. And the worst thing that can happen is you don't get an answer and you pick another project. And the best thing is that they're very happy and excited that you want to help, and they'll give you something that you can help with. So what Ingewikkeld, we basically thought, okay, so who is working for us as a company, and what are the things that they are interested in? And we have two of the maintainers of PHP Documenter in our company, so it was a logical decision to say, okay, they can spend some time on working on PHP Documenter. And I cannot take full credits, but the new PHP Documenter guides was partially developed during Ingewikkeld time. And that's a great new component that they built. So I mean, I'm proud of that. They did some really good work there. So that it made sense to accommodate that. And another question we had, or we asked ourselves, was, what is the technology that we work with a lot? Because it makes sense that if we contribute to something where, if that contribution is accepted, we benefit as well. Not just us, everyone that uses it, but we as well. So that were the most important questions that we asked ourselves, and that you can ask yourselves as well if you want to start with contributing to open source. And that leads us back to the why. I already mentioned we don't want projects to die because people don't maintain it anymore for whatever reason. But there are a lot of other reasons why you want to support open source. First of all, of course, being a good open source citizen. But I imagine that, like the boss that I talked about, not everyone is interested in being a good open source citizen. But you know, I find it really hard to understand those people because there are so many people using, for instance, Fly System, which is a library for storage abstraction. But Fly System is mostly maintained by one person. And I don't understand, why can we not contribute to that? What is so hard about that? So contribute something, whether it's code or documentation or design or whatever. Contribute something. And then there's, of course, the benefit to yourself. If you contribute an improvement, then you get the improvement as well. Instead of just keeping it for yourself in a private module or whatever, give it back to the community. And then one thing that a lot of people don't seem to think of immediately is the benefit to the developers that work on open source. Because contributing to open source is a learning experience. Gary said it this morning, you get free code reviews. So any code that you write is, okay, not everyone is given free code reviews. The code that you write, when you send a pull request to the original project, if the maintainer is interested in that, they will review your code and tell you what can be improved, or what is good or what is not good, and things like that. And you learn from that. As a developer, you learn from feedback that you get, as long as the feedback is good, of course. So it is a learning experience, also in determining what needs to be done and things like that. So there's a lot of things. One of the great things I learned from being a translator of the Zen framework documentation is that I had to translate documentation for components that I had never used before. And I found out how useful actually this component was, and that I could have used it in a couple of projects already that I did before that. So it's a great way to learn stuff. And the stuff that you learn, you can use again later in a project at some point. And one thing that is interesting is if you send in a pull request to a project and it gets rejected, that's also a learning experience. You learn to handle disappointment, I don't know, or you learn to understand why it wasn't accepted. Because it's still a possibility, of course, that whatever you want to add or improve or fix, that the maintainer does not agree with you. My first pull request to Symfony was rejected because Fabien thought it wasn't a useful addition to the framework. Well, that's fine. I learned from that, and then I built it myself in a bundle, but yeah, okay. It's still an option, right? Then there is another thing. Oh, I actually have bullet points for this. Then there is another thing which is more interesting, I think, to business owners and managers and people that care about money. And that is the marketing. The marketing boost you get from contributing to open source. Because when you contribute to open source as a company, some projects will give you a shout out on their social media, or a developer goes to the GitHub page and sees, oh, this person committed and they work for that company. Oh, so that company actually, oh, well, that's good, that's nice. And also, they are apparently an expert on this project because they even contribute back to this project. So that's good marketing. And if you're looking for developers as a company, which a lot of companies are doing, this is something to advertise with. If you join our company, then you can actually contribute back to open source. Not everyone will like that, but this has a big attraction, as I've found out. Our developers have given us feedback that they really like that we facilitate them in contributing to open source. So it is marketing for you. Well, I've already given the recruitment, so I'm not going to do that anymore. And then the next slide is not for everyone, not for every company, but it can actually help you convince, especially the people that care a lot about money. And that's money. Is Gary here? Gary cared about money. If you contribute to open source and people see that you are actually good at that, then they will hire you because of the fact that you contributed to Project X or Project Y. They might hire you if they are, I don't know, they use a specific open source project, but they run into issues with that project, and they have no idea who can help, so they start looking around, and they find you because you made a contribution to that project, and then they hire you to help them fix that bug, or fix the performance problem that they're running into, or something like that. If you're even better at promoting yourself, you could even sell like specific consulting services for that specific project, or even training, which is a great way to earn project. And of course, we are not all the Adobe who sell their big Magento courses. We are not all the Drupal or Symfony. We don't all have a project that big. But even if you're not the original company building the project, you can still offer your services. And in that way, find new customers. And we've done that for a very long time at Ingewikkeld. A lot of people found us because we did some stuff on Open Source Project X, or we spoke at a conference and people heard that we knew what we were talking about, and then contacted us to see if we could help them. Speaking of which, I am available on short term, so if you need a developer, talk to me afterwards. No, but seriously, this is, if for no other reason, this can be a very good reason, a very good way to convince your boss to let you contribute to open source, or to convince, if you're an owner, a co-owner, convince your other owners, your partners, to give something back to the open source community. Because the open source community needs it. I don't want to go back to that picture again, but we don't want that one single project to fail at some point, because then, I mean, how many people remember things like Heartbleed? One bug can basically take down the internet, sort of. If you have the right project, that's a big problem. So we need to do something as companies, not just as individuals, but also as companies. We shouldn't just give up our free time on open source. We should get paid to do that. And some people are able to do that. Right, Juliette? Sometimes. But a lot of people should get paid, but they don't get paid to do that. So please try and contribute to open source as a business, and help us, all of us, everyone in the world, to keep everything up and running. Any questions? There is a question there. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. We'll wait for the microphone. Oh, we have a throwing cube, but that's even more fun. Oh yeah, okay. Give it a minute. They're almost done. Or 5 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, there it is. Yes.
Does it work?
It works.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan, for your very nice talk. One thing I have a question on, and that is on the complexity of open source, because I think I know a lot of people who want to contribute, and I also have a plan for that. But we get stuck in the complexity because it is not that easy. And even if you look at testing, let's say at the Matomo project, which I really appreciate, then they have such an complex, I would say ingewikkeld for your company, testing structure that the entrance level we experience is quite high. Do you have any advice how to deal with that?
Well, there's a couple of things I think that can help with that. First of all, maybe you have to go back to the drawing board and find a project that fits better the level of your developers. Also, if you have one developer that, for instance, already knows more about this project than the rest, then their contribution could be to help the rest. And they will learn a lot from doing that helping. So that is also a good way of contributing. And of course, you can contact the project, the maintainer of the project, and ask them, you know, this is the level that my developers are at this point. Is there anything they can do to contribute to your project? And in that way, well, if they answer you and tell you, well, there's these things that they can probably pick up on, that will already help them a lot.
Okay, thank you. I think we will go for some easier projects then.
Any more questions? Well, Wim, you want a cube, right? You already have a cube. Question up here in the front.
Not really a question, but maybe worth mentioning. If you think about open source and if you're maintaining a project, there are options in GitHub right now to make sure if you get hit by the bus, your project gets pulled over to someone who can take the care over. Right. So maybe worth mentioning if someone listens and think, oh, if I get hit by the bus, my product is abandoned.
So you can configure like another user
Yeah, you
that can take over in case of
Yes.
emergency.
Deadman switch.
like that, yes.
I did not
possible.
know this was an option. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
there's an option, so
Nice, nice, very nice.
can throw it someone else.
Any more questions?
Or maybe just for fun. Just liking to throw things.
Someone in the back.
We can do a throw around if you want.
Oh, there's one in the back. You can throw it all the way to the back. Yeah.
Test? Yes. Do you know the company is called Spatie in Antwerpen?
Yes.
They have a lot of open source packages for Laravel, as you know them.
Yeah.
And what's your opinion on that business model? I think that's maybe also very valuable for the community.
Well, their business model is they have a lot of different ways of earning money, which is really great, right? So they offer some SaaS products where you just pay for their product, but they also offer a lot of libraries, which I think, if I remember correctly, is postcardware. So if you use it, then you should just send them a postcard, which is like really awesome. So I really like that. I really like what they are doing, and I think I didn't really talk about that, but I think that especially in the PHP world, that Laravel is doing actually a really good job in finding ways to earn money off of open source. In that there are a lot of packages. Like I worked on a Laravel project recently, and I used Laravel Nova, which is like $99, one-time payment, and I can use it forever, at least the current version. And that saves me a lot of time, which is like a no-brainer. But for the company making it, they get in money, so that helps them to keep that continuity going. So that's actually a great way, and there's a lot of other big open source communities in the PHP world that don't yet have such a model. So actually, Laravel in general, but Spatie specifically, they have a really good way of making sure that they get in money. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions?
We have time for about one or two more questions.
One or two more questions. Well, if there's no more, then that's easy. So if it still works, yes. I'll switch to this one, my blog, my company, and I'm not on Twitter anymore. My account still exists, but I don't look at it anymore. Thank you. But I do have Mastodon, so you can contact me there. And if you have any feedback, let me know and join in. That's always useful, how to improve my talk or what I did well. So thank you very much.